The dust never settled proper at Holloway's trading post. Even now, 13 years gone, I can still taste it on my tongue when the wind shifts east across the mesa, gritty and bitter, like crushed bone mixed with prairie sage. Great Uncle Ezra used to say that dust held memories, and maybe he was right. Maybe that's why I kept going back there, long after the building went to ruin and the wooden sign fell sideways into the weeds. I was 16 when Uncle Ezra vanished, old enough to know something terrible had happened, young enough to believe he might still come riding back with that crooked grin and a sack full of stories. He had a way of making the ordinary seem magical without crossing into foolishness. A broken horseshoe became a lucky charm, a smooth river stone turned into a worry bead that could calm any storm. Everything had purpose in his hands, even the things other folks would toss aside. The trading post sat where three territories met, a crossroads for trappers, settlers, and the occasional outlaw looking to disappear into the vastness. Uncle Ezra knew them all by name, or at least by the stories they carried. He'd trade flour for fox pelts, ammunition for information, and sometimes just coffee for company. The post was more than commerce. It was a gathering place where news traveled faster than horses and secrets got buried deeper than wells. That October morning started like any other. The cottonwoods along Bitter Creek had turned gold, and the first frost had silvered the grass in the meadow behind our homestead. Uncle Ezra loaded his wagon with supplies, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, and 3 bottles of whiskey he kept for special customers. The wagon wheels creaked familiar songs as they rolled down the rutted path toward the trading post, and I watched until the dust cloud faded into the morning haze. By evening, the worry had settled into our bones like winter cold. Uncle Ezra never missed supper without sending word. Ma paced the kitchen, her boots wearing patterns in the pine boards, while Pa sat by the window with his pipe unlit, staring toward the road. The silence stretched between us like a taut rope, ready to snap with the weight of unspoken fears. When dawn broke without him, Pa rode to the trading post with 2 of our neighbors. They found the wagon overturned in the creek, supplies scattered like leaves in the current. Uncle Ezra's hat floated downstream, caught on a fallen branch, but there was no sign of him, no blood, no struggle, no explanation. Just the empty space where a man used to be, and the questions that would follow us for years. The search lasted 3 weeks. We combed every gulch, every cave, every stand of timber within 20 miles. The territorial marshal came through with his deputy, asking questions and taking notes in a leather-bound book. They found tracks that led nowhere, evidence that explained nothing. Uncle Ezra had simply vanished, as if the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Winter came early that year, and the snow covered whatever traces might have remained. The trading post stood empty through the cold months, its windows dark and its door hanging crooked on rusted hinges. When spring arrived, nobody wanted to reopen it. The place felt cursed, folks said, and maybe they were right, or maybe it just felt empty without Uncle Ezra's laughter echoing off the log walls. I grew up carrying that emptiness with me. Through my wedding to Clara, through the birth of our 3 children, through the years of drought and plenty that followed, Uncle Ezra's disappearance remained an open wound that never quite healed. Sometimes I'd dream of him, still trading stories for smiles, still making the broken world seem worth fixing. But I always woke up to the same bitter truth. He was gone, and we might never know why. Time has a way of wearing down even the sharpest edges of grief. The questions became part of me, like scars that ache when the weather changes. I stopped expecting answers and learned to live with the mystery. That's what I thought anyway, until last week when Clara found that old trunk in the back of the barn, and everything I thought I knew about Uncle Ezra's disappearance got turned upside down like his wagon in the creek. Clara was looking for wool blankets when she found it. The trunk sat wedged behind a stack of old fence posts, covered in dust and spider webs like it had been forgotten by time itself. She called to me from the barn, her voice carrying that particular note of excitement that meant she'd discovered something worth seeing. I set down my coffee and walked out into the afternoon heat, wondering what treasure she'd unearthed from our collection of cast-offs and memories. The trunk was older than I'd expected, made of dark wood with brass corners gone green with age. The leather straps had cracked and split, and the lock had rusted through long ago. Clara had already worked it open, revealing layers of faded fabric and the musty smell of decades past. At first glance, it looked like any other collection of forgotten belongings. Old clothes, a pair of worn boots, a hat with a feather that had seen better days. But then Clara lifted out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. The cover was unmarked except for water stains that bloomed across the surface like pressed flowers. She handed it to me with careful fingers, as if she sensed the weight of what we'd found. The leather felt familiar under my touch, smooth and worn from years of handling, though I couldn't place where I'd seen it before. I opened the journal to the first page, and Uncle Ezra's handwriting stared back at me like a ghost. The script was unmistakable. Those careful loops and flourishes he'd learned from his schoolteacher mother, the way he dotted his I's with tiny circles instead of dots. My hands trembled as I read the first entry, dated just 2 weeks before his disappearance. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of a man who knew his time was running short. "The walls are closing in," he'd written. "Open Carlyle knows about the silver, and he's not the type to let sleeping dogs lie. I've been careful, but careful might not be enough. If something happens to me, I want my family to know the truth. The real truth, not the stories I've been telling all these years." Clara sat beside me on an overturned bucket, her hand resting on my shoulder as I read. She'd been married to me long enough to know when silence was needed, when the weight of discovery required time to settle. The barn creaked around us, stirring with the afternoon breeze, while dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight streaming through the gaps in the siding. The entries that followed painted a picture of Uncle Ezra I'd never seen before. Not the jovial trader who swapped stories for smiles, but a man caught in the middle of something dangerous and complex. He wrote about silver mines in the hills, about claims that weren't properly filed, about men who came to the trading post asking questions that made his skin crawl. Names I didn't recognize filled the pages, along with dates and amounts that suggested business dealings far more complicated than simple trading. One name appeared more than the others: Carlyle. The way Uncle Ezra wrote about him, with careful words and cautious phrasing, suggested a man to be feared rather than trusted. He smiled too much during our last meeting. One entry read, "Men who smile that much usually have something to hide, and what Carlyle's hiding could get us all killed." As I read deeper into the journal, the entries became more urgent, more desperate. Uncle Ezra had discovered something about the silver mines, something that put him in danger. He'd been gathering evidence, collecting proof of claims that had been falsified and titles that had been forged. The trading post wasn't just a place of commerce, it was his base of operations for an investigation that had grown too big for one man to handle. The final entry was dated the day before his disappearance. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic, as if he'd been writing by lamplight with one ear listening for trouble. "They're coming for me tonight," he'd written. "I can feel it in my bones. I've hidden the evidence where they'll never find it, but I don't know if I'll live to see it used. If I don't make it home, tell my family I love them more than silver or gold. Some things are worth more than fortune, and family is the greatest treasure of all." The second section of the journal revealed a different Uncle Ezra altogether, not the simple trader we'd known, but a man who'd stumbled onto something that could have made him rich or gotten him killed, maybe both. The entries from 2 years before his disappearance painted a careful picture of discovery and growing alarm, written in his methodical way that left no detail unrecorded. It started with a conversation overheard at the trading post. 2 prospectors had come through, drunk on whiskey and loose with their tongues, talking about a silver strike up in the Sangre de Cristo mountains. They'd mentioned names and locations, claim numbers and assay reports, details that most folks would have ignored or forgotten. But Uncle Ezra had a memory like a steel trap, and he'd written it all down after they left. The strike itself wasn't unusual. Silver had been found all through those mountains, and men had been getting rich and going broke on mining claims for years. What caught Uncle Ezra's attention was the way the prospectors had talked about it, nervous and guilty, like they were discussing something they shouldn't know. They'd mentioned a man named Carlyle, said he was buying up claims faster than wildfire, paying good money for land that hadn't shown color yet. Uncle Ezra's curiosity had been aroused. He started asking questions, careful and casual, during the normal course of trading. He learned that Carlyle was indeed buying claims, but not from the original prospectors. He was purchasing them from a territorial claims office, using paperwork that looked official, but felt wrong to those who knew how such things usually worked. The original prospectors were nowhere to be found, and the claims were being sold to Carlyle for a fraction of their worth. The more Uncle Ezra investigated, the clearer the picture became. Carlyle wasn't just buying claims, he was stealing them. He had connections in the territorial office, men who could forge documents and backdate claims, making it look like he'd filed first when he'd actually filed last. The original prospectors were either bought off, scared off, or worse. Those who refused to sell found their claims suddenly invalid, their paperwork mysteriously lost or destroyed. Uncle Ezra had documented it all with the thoroughness of an accountant and the patience of a hunter. He'd traveled to the territorial office, copied down claim numbers and filing dates, compared them to the stories he'd heard at the trading post. The evidence was overwhelming. Carlyle was running a systematic operation to steal silver claims, and he was making a fortune doing it, but evidence without proof was just paper and ink. Uncle Ezra needed something more concrete, something that would hold up in a court of law, or at least convince the territorial marshal to investigate. He'd started making copies of documents, taking photographs with a camera he'd borrowed from a traveling photographer, building a case that could bring Carlyle's operation to justice. The journal entries from this period showed a man walking a tightrope between justice and survival. Uncle Ezra knew he was playing a dangerous game, but he also knew that good men were being cheated out of their rightful claims. He wrote about sleepless nights, about looking over his shoulder, about the weight of carrying secrets that could get him killed. Carlyle had started showing up at the trading post more frequently, always with a smile and a friendly word. But Uncle Ezra could see the calculation behind his eyes. The visits were reconnaissance missions, attempts to gauge how much Uncle Ezra knew and how much he suspected. Each conversation was a chess match, with stakes higher than either man openly acknowledged. The tension had been building for months when Uncle Ezra made his final discovery. Carlyle wasn't just stealing claims. He was selling them to Eastern investors, men who would never set foot in the territory but were willing to pay top dollar for guaranteed silver strikes. The whole operation was a confidence game on a massive scale, and Uncle Ezra held the evidence that could bring it all crashing down. That's when he'd started making plans for his own survival. The journal entries from his final weeks showed a man preparing for the worst while hoping for the best. He'd hidden his evidence in multiple locations, created copies of the most damning documents, and begun to plan his exit strategy. But he'd also known that men like Carlyle didn't let loose ends walk away, and Uncle Ezra had become the loosest end of all. The final weeks of Uncle Ezra's life, as recorded in his journal, read like the slow closing of a trap. He'd become aware that Carlyle was having him watched, that his movements were being tracked and his conversations monitored. The trading post, which had always been his sanctuary, had become a stage where every word and gesture was scrutinized for hidden meaning. Uncle Ezra wrote about the changes in his regular customers. Men who'd been coming to the post for years suddenly seemed nervous around him, their conversations stilted and their eyes darting toward the door. Some stopped coming altogether, and those who did arrive often left quickly, as if they were afraid of being seen there. The natural flow of commerce and conversation that had sustained the post for years was drying up like a creek in drought. Carlyle's visits had become more frequent and more pointed. He'd taken to arriving just before closing time, when the other customers had left, and Uncle Ezra was alone with his ledgers and his thoughts. The conversations were always friendly on the surface, full of jokes and local gossip, but underneath ran a current of threat that Uncle Ezra felt in his bones. One entry described a particularly tense encounter 3 weeks before the disappearance. Carlyle had brought 2 men with him, introduced them as business partners from back east. They'd looked around the trading post with the calculating eyes of men appraising property, asking questions about the building's construction, the land it sat on, and the volume of trade that passed through its doors. Uncle Ezra had realized they weren't just evaluating the building, they were evaluating him. The questions were designed to gauge his worth as a potential ally or the extent of his danger as an enemy. When they'd left that evening, Uncle Ezra had written, "They looked at me like I was a problem to be solved. I don't think they've decided yet whether the solution involves money or bullets." The journal revealed that Uncle Ezra had been trying to find a way out of the situation without abandoning his principles or his evidence. He'd considered approaching the territorial marshal, but Carlyle's influence extended into official channels, and Uncle Ezra wasn't sure who could be trusted. He'd thought about leaving the territory altogether, but that would mean abandoning his family and his life's work. Instead, he decided to make one last trade, not goods for money, but information for safety. He'd arranged to meet with a representative from the territorial governor's office, a man named Patterson, who'd been investigating irregularities in mining claims. The meeting was set for the morning after Uncle Ezra's disappearance, at a location 50 miles from the trading post. Uncle Ezra had planned to turn over all his evidence to Patterson, trusting that the territorial government would have the power and authority to bring Carlyle to justice. In return, he'd hoped for protection, perhaps even a new identity and a fresh start, somewhere far from the silver mines and their bloody secrets. But the plan had required careful timing and absolute secrecy. Uncle Ezra had spent his final days preparing, copying the most important documents, organizing his evidence into a coherent narrative that would be easy for Patterson to understand and act upon. He'd also made provisions for his family, writing letters to be delivered in case he didn't survive the transition. The night before his disappearance, he'd made one final entry in the journal. His handwriting was steady, but the words carried the weight of a man who knew he might not see another sunrise. "I've done what I could," he'd written. "The evidence is secure, the meeting is arranged, and my conscience is clear. If Carlyle gets to me before I can get to Patterson, at least I'll die, knowing I tried to do the right thing." He'd ended the entry with a message for his family. "Tell them I loved them more than they'll ever know. Tell them the trading post was never about the money. It was about the people, the stories, the connections that make us human. Tell them that some things are worth dying for, and justice is one of them." The final page of the journal contained a detailed map showing the locations where Uncle Ezra had hidden his evidence. 3 different spots, each marked with symbols that only our family would recognize. The map was drawn with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized all his work, complete with landmarks and distances that would make the hiding places easy to find. The morning after Clara and I found the journal, I rode out to the first location marked on Uncle Ezra's map. The spot was in Devil's Canyon, about 5 miles northeast of the old trading post, where a lightning-struck pine tree stood guard over a tumble of red rocks. The tree was still there, blackened and twisted but stubbornly alive, its branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. Uncle Ezra had marked the spot with a symbol that looked like a horseshoe, and I remembered him teaching me that sign when I was a boy. It meant good luck in the private language he'd developed for marking his trap lines and caches. The irony wasn't lost on me. He'd needed more luck than he'd found, but maybe his evidence would provide some justice 13 years after the fact. I found the cache exactly where the map indicated, hidden beneath a flat stone that had been carefully placed to look natural. The oilskin pouch inside was still intact, protected from moisture and decay by Uncle Ezra's careful preparation. Inside were documents that made my blood run cold, claim forms with forged signatures, correspondence between Carlyle and his Eastern investors, and a detailed accounting of the money that had changed hands. The second location was harder to reach, up on Mesa Verde, where the old Apache trails wound through stands of scrub oak and juniper. Uncle Ezra had marked it with a symbol that looked like a crossed axe, meaning danger in his private code. The cache was hidden in a crevice in the rock face, sealed with pine pitch and wrapped in leather that had aged to the color of old blood. This pouch contained the most damning evidence of all. Photographs of the forged documents, copies of letters that implicated territorial officials in Carlyle's scheme, and a list of the men who'd been killed or disappeared when they'd refused to cooperate. Uncle Ezra had been building a case that would have brought down not just Carlyle, but the entire network of corruption that had made his operation possible. The third location was the most personal. Uncle Ezra had hidden it at the old homestead where he'd grown up, beneath the oak tree where our grandmother used to sit and shell peas on summer evenings. The symbol on the map was a heart, meaning family, and the cache contained letters written to each of us, explaining his actions and asking for our forgiveness. Reading those letters was like hearing Uncle Ezra's voice from beyond the grave. He'd written to my father about the weight of carrying secrets, to my mother about the importance of doing what's right even when it's dangerous, and to me about the value of truth over comfort. The letters were dated just days before his disappearance, written in the careful script of a man who knew he might not have another chance to say goodbye. But the most important item in the family cache wasn't a letter or a document. It was a small leather journal, bound with a string that had been tied in Uncle Ezra's distinctive knot. Inside were his final thoughts, written in the hours before he'd planned to leave for his meeting with Patterson. The entries were brief but revealing, showing a man who'd made peace with his decision despite the risks. "I could have kept quiet," he'd written. "Could have minded my own business and let Carlyle steal whatever he wanted. But that's not the man Ma raised me to be. A man who stands by while others are robbed isn't much of a man at all. If I die for this, at least I'll die knowing I tried to make things right." The journal also contained details about the meeting with Patterson, including the exact location and time. Uncle Ezra had chosen a spot near the territorial border, where he could escape into New Mexico if things went wrong. He'd planned to travel light and fast, taking only his horse and the evidence he'd so carefully compiled. Reading about his preparations, I realized that Uncle Ezra had never intended to disappear forever. He'd been planning to return once Carlyle was in custody, to resume his life at the trading post and continue the work he'd always loved. The disappearance had been meant as a temporary measure, a way to stay alive long enough to see justice done. But something had gone wrong. Either Carlyle had discovered the plan, or Patterson had betrayed the meeting, or Uncle Ezra had simply run out of time and luck. The evidence he'd gathered with such care had remained hidden while he'd vanished into the vastness of the territory, leaving behind only questions and the bitter taste of unfinished business. Armed with Uncle Ezra's evidence and the details from his final journal, I rode to the meeting place he'd arranged with Patterson. The location was a trading post called Murphy's Station, situated in a valley where the Santa Fe Trail crossed Willow Creek. The building had been abandoned for years, its adobe walls crumbling and its roof open to the sky, but it still commanded a view of the surrounding country that would have appealed to Uncle Ezra's caution. I arrived at dawn, the same time Uncle Ezra would have reached the meeting point 13 years earlier. The morning light painted the valley in shades of gold and amber, and I could understand why he'd chosen this spot. A man could see riders approaching from any direction, and there were multiple escape routes through the hills if things went wrong. The ruins of Murphy's Station told their own story of abandonment and decay. The trading post had been larger than Uncle Ezra's, with corrals and outbuildings that had once housed a thriving business. Now it was home to pack rats and ravens, its walls scarred by wind and weather, its doorways empty frames that looked out on nothing but memories. I searched the ruins carefully, looking for any sign that Uncle Ezra had made it this far. The evidence was subtle but unmistakable. A horseshoe nail driven into a wooden beam, marked with the same symbol Uncle Ezra had used in his map. He'd been here, had arrived for the meeting and waited, probably growing more anxious as the hours passed without Patterson's arrival. In the main room of the trading post, I found something that made my heart skip. Scratched into the adobe wall, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, was a message in Uncle Ezra's careful handwriting. P. didn't come. Carlisle knows. Going to ground. Find the truth. The message was dated the day of Uncle Ezra's disappearance, scratched into the wall with a knife point or a horseshoe nail. Below it, in smaller letters, was the word betrayed and an arrow pointing west toward the mountains and the territory beyond. Uncle Ezra had waited for Patterson, realized the meeting was compromised, and made the decision to disappear rather than return home to face certain death. I followed the arrow west, climbing into the foothills where the terrain became rougher and the trails less defined. The country was perfect for a man who wanted to vanish. Maze of canyons and ridges, hidden valleys and secret springs that only the mountain men and the Apache knew. Uncle Ezra had trapped these hills as a young man, and he'd known every deer path and every cave. 3 miles from Murphy's Station, I found the remains of a camp. The fire ring was old and cold, but the stones had been arranged in Uncle Ezra's distinctive pattern, and there were signs that someone had spent several days here. Horseshoe prints in the dried mud of a nearby spring matched the shoes Uncle Ezra's horse had worn, and I found a coffee can with his initials scratched into the bottom. The camp was positioned with a clear view of the back trail, confirming that Uncle Ezra had been watching for pursuit. He'd chosen his spot well, with water and shelter and multiple escape routes. From here, he could have seen riders approaching from miles away, and the rocky terrain would have made tracking difficult even for experienced trackers. But the camp also told a story of desperation and dwindling supplies. The fire ring showed signs of repeated use, and there were marks in the earth that suggested Uncle Ezra had been digging for edible roots. He'd been prepared for a short journey, not an extended stay in the wilderness, and his resources had been running low. I found his final message carved into a sandstone boulder that overlooked the camp. The letters were deep and clear, cut with the blade of a knife over what must have been hours of careful work. Carlisle's men found me, heading for the border. If you find this, tell my family I tried to come home. The truth is buried with the silver. Justice will have to wait. Below the message, Uncle Ezra had carved a rough map showing his intended route toward the territorial border. The trail led through some of the roughest country in the territory, a landscape of deep canyons and towering mesas that could hide a man forever or kill him trying. It was a desperate gamble, the choice of a man who'd run out of better options. I spent the rest of the day following the trail Uncle Ezra had marked, but the signs grew fainter as I climbed higher into the mountains. The terrain became increasingly difficult, and I realized that a man on a tired horse carrying limited supplies and pursued by enemies, would have faced almost impossible odds. Uncle Ezra had been brave and determined, but courage alone wasn't always enough to overcome the harsh realities of the wilderness. As the sun set behind the peaks, I made camp in a sheltered grove of aspen trees and tried to imagine Uncle Ezra's final hours. He'd been alone in this vast country, carrying evidence that could have brought down Carlyle's operation, but unable to get it to the right people. He died knowing the truth but unable to share it. A man who'd sacrificed everything for justice and found only silence. The ride back to the homestead took me through the ruins of Uncle Ezra's trading post, and I stopped to walk through the empty rooms one final time. The walls still held the echo of voices and laughter, the memory of countless transactions and conversations that had made this place the heart of our small community. But now I could also feel the weight of the secrets it had harbored, the dangerous knowledge that had ultimately cost Uncle Ezra his life. I stood in the main room where Uncle Ezra had conducted his business, trying to imagine him hiding his growing fear behind the smile and easy conversation that had been his trademark. The counter where he'd tallied accounts and made change was still there, scarred by 13 years of weather and neglect. Behind it, the shelves that had once held goods from across the territory stood empty, their bare boards grey with age and dust. Clara was waiting for me when I returned home, her face reflecting the questions I'd been carrying since we'd found the journal. She'd spent the day reading through Uncle Ezra's letters, and I could see the weight of his story in her eyes. We sat on the porch as the sun set, sharing the pieces of the puzzle we'd discovered and trying to understand the man we'd thought we'd known. The evidence Uncle Ezra had compiled was overwhelming in its scope and damning in its detail. Carlyle's operation had been systematic and ruthless, stealing claims worth hundreds of thousands of dollars and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The list of victims was longer than I'd expected, including prospectors, territorial officials, and at least one newspaper editor who'd asked too many questions. But the evidence was also 13 years old, and many of the men involved were dead or disappeared. Carlyle himself had died in a mining accident 5 years earlier, though Uncle Ezra's journal suggested that even that might not have been accidental. The Eastern investors had long since taken their profits and moved on to other schemes, leaving behind only the empty mines and the ghosts of the men who'd died to expose them. Clara asked the question that had been haunting me since I'd found Uncle Ezra's final message. What were we supposed to do with the truth? The territorial government that might have acted on the evidence was gone, replaced by statehood and new officials who had no memory of the old corruption. The marshal who might have investigated was dead, and the newspapers that might have publicized the story had closed or changed hands. I told her about the promise I'd made to Uncle Ezra's memory, standing beside his final camp in the mountains. Justice might have been delayed, but it didn't have to be denied forever. The truth about Carlyle's operation and Uncle Ezra's courage deserved to be told, even if it was too late for legal action. The families of the other victims deserved to know what had happened to their loved ones, and the community deserved to understand the price that had been paid for their silence. We spent the evening making plans, deciding how to share Uncle Ezra's story without endangering ourselves or others. Clara suggested starting with the Territorial Historical Society, which had been collecting stories about the mining boom and the violence that had accompanied it. They might be interested in Uncle Ezra's evidence, not for legal proceedings, but for the historical record. I thought about the families of the other victims, scattered across the territory and beyond. Some might still be alive, still wondering what had happened to their sons and fathers and brothers. Uncle Ezra's journal contained enough information to provide answers, closure for wounds that had never properly healed. It wouldn't bring back the dead, but it might bring peace to the living. The decision to go public with Uncle Ezra's story wasn't easy. We'd be exposing ourselves to attention we didn't want, possibly even danger from those who might still have reasons to keep the truth buried. But the alternative was to let Uncle Ezra's sacrifice remain meaningless, to allow his courage to be forgotten along with the crimes he died trying to expose. As I sat on the porch that night, listening to the sounds of the desert settling into darkness, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. Uncle Ezra had carried the burden of truth alone, and it had cost him everything. Now it was my turn to carry that burden, to see that his story was told and his sacrifice honored. The trading post sat empty in the distance, its dark windows reflecting the stars like closed eyes. Tomorrow, I would begin the work of bringing Uncle Ezra's story to light, of ensuring that the truth he'd died protecting would finally be heard. It was the least I could do for the man who'd shaped my childhood, and whose courage had shaped the man I'd become. 3 months after finding Uncle Ezra's journal, I stood before the Territorial Historical Society in the capital, holding the evidence that had cost him his life. The room was full of academics and officials, journalists and historians, all eager to hear the story that had been buried for 13 years. I'd practiced the presentation countless times, but my hands still trembled as I opened the leather portfolio that contained Uncle Ezra's legacy. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The Historical Society voted unanimously to preserve Uncle Ezra's evidence in their archives, ensuring that future generations would know the truth about Carlisle's operation and the men who died opposing it. The territorial newspaper ran a series of articles about the case, finally giving Uncle Ezra the justice he'd sought in life. More importantly, the publicity brought forward other families who'd lost loved ones to Carlisle's violence. A widow in Santa Fe identified her husband's name on Uncle Ezra's list of victims. A son in Albuquerque learned why his father had never returned from a prospecting trip. The evidence Uncle Ezra had compiled became a key to unlocking a dozen different mysteries, providing closure to families who'd spent years wondering and grieving. The territorial government, embarrassed by the revelations of corruption in their ranks, ordered a full investigation of mining claims from the period. They found that Carlisle's operation had been even more extensive than Uncle Ezra had documented, affecting claims throughout the territory and beyond. The investigation led to the return of several properties to their rightful owners and the establishment of new procedures to prevent similar fraud in the future. But the most meaningful response came from the community around the old trading post. The neighbors who'd known Uncle Ezra, who'd traded with him and shared stories around his fire, organized a memorial service to honor his memory and his sacrifice. They wanted to rebuild the trading post as a monument to his courage, a place where his story could be told and his values could be remembered. Clara and I attended the memorial service on a clear October morning, 13 years and 1 day after Uncle Ezra's disappearance. The service was held at the site of the old trading post, where someone had cleared away the debris and planted wildflowers in the shape of Uncle Ezra's trading symbol. The flowers were blooming despite the season, as if the earth itself was celebrating his vindication. The crowd was larger than I'd expected, including people who'd traveled from across the territory to pay their respects. There were former customers who remembered Uncle Ezra's kindness, lawmen who'd been inspired by his courage, and families who'd benefited from the truth he died protecting. The service was simple but profound, befitting a man who'd valued substance over show. As the crowd dispersed, I walked to the spot where Uncle Ezra had conducted his final business, where he'd hidden his fears behind a smile and prepared for the confrontation that would cost him his life. The location felt different now. Not empty, but full of purpose, as if his sacrifice had transformed the place from a monument to loss into a testament to justice. I thought about the journal entries I'd memorized, the careful words of a man who'd known the price of truth and paid it willingly. Uncle Ezra had written that some things were worth dying for, and justice was one of them. He'd also written that family was the greatest treasure of all, and I finally understood what he'd meant. His family hadn't just been the relatives who'd mourned his disappearance. It had included everyone who'd been touched by his kindness, inspired by his courage, or protected by his sacrifice. The trading post had been more than a business. It had been a community, a place where justice and mercy had been as important as profit and loss. Standing there in the afternoon sun, I made a promise to Uncle Ezra's memory and to the community he'd served. The truth about his disappearance would not be forgotten, and the values he'd embodied would not be lost. The trading post would be rebuilt, not just as a monument, but as a working reminder of what one man's courage could accomplish. I turned to walk back to my horse, but stopped for one last look at the ruins. The walls were still standing, weathered but solid, like the truth Uncle Ezra had died protecting. Time and neglect had scarred the adobe, but they couldn't destroy what Uncle Ezra had built here. The foundation was too strong, rooted in something deeper than commerce or convenience. Clara took my hand as we walked toward our wagon, her fingers warm against mine despite the October chill. She'd been my anchor through the difficult months of investigation and revelation, helping me carry the weight of Uncle Ezra's story when it threatened to overwhelm me. Together, we'd learned that some burdens are lighter when shared, and some truths grow stronger when spoken aloud. The ride home took us past the 3 locations where Uncle Ezra had hidden his evidence. Each spot now felt different to me, not like a grave marker, but like a way station on a journey toward justice. The lightning-struck pines still reached toward the sky. The red rocks of Devil's Canyon still caught the afternoon light, and Grandmother's Oak still provided shade for those who needed rest. Uncle Ezra's hiding places had become part of the landscape's story, woven into the history of a place where good men had struggled against corruption and won. As we reached our homestead, I could see the lights beginning to flicker on in the windows of neighboring farms. Each light represented a family, a story, a life that Uncle Ezra had touched in some way. His influence had spread like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, touching people he'd never met and places he'd never been. The truth he'd preserved had become a gift to future generations, a reminder that justice delayed is not always justice denied. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote the final entry in Uncle Ezra's journal, not as him, but as the nephew who'd found his story and chosen to tell it. I wrote about the weight of carrying secrets and the relief of sharing burdens. I wrote about the difference between disappearing and being lost, between death and meaninglessness. Most of all, I wrote about the trading post he'd built and the community he'd created, and how both would live on long after the last adobe brick had crumbled to dust. The journal now sits on our mantelpiece, no longer a collection of secrets but a testament to courage. Sometimes visitors ask about it, and Clara and I tell them Uncle Ezra's story. We talk about the trading post and the silver mines, about corruption and justice, about the price of truth and the value of family. We tell them that heroes don't always wear badges or carry guns, that sometimes they wear aprons and carry ledger books, and that the most important battles are often fought by ordinary people who simply refuse to look away when others are being wronged. Uncle Ezra's trading post will be rebuilt, but it will never be the same. The new building will serve the same function, providing goods and services to the community, but it will also serve as a reminder of what happened here and why it mattered. There will be a plaque honoring Uncle Ezra's memory, and the story of his courage will be told to every child who grows up in the shadow of the mountains where he made his final stand. I've come to understand that Uncle Ezra didn't really disappear 13 years ago. He just changed forms, from flesh and blood into memory and inspiration. The man who used to weigh flour and count change behind the trading post counter lives on in every act of courage performed by those who knew his story. His legacy isn't buried in some unmarked grave in the mountains. It's alive in the hearts of people who believe that justice matters more than comfort, that truth matters more than profit, and that family matters more than fortune. The dust still swirls around the old trading post when the wind shifts east across the mesa. But now when I taste it on my tongue, I don't think of loss and mystery. I think of Uncle Ezra standing behind his counter, weighing not just goods but choices, measuring not just distances but the space between right and wrong. The dust carries his story now, spreading it across the territory like seeds on the wind, ensuring that his sacrifice will never be forgotten and his courage will never be lost.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.